Hello, folks. I don't see myself on the screen, so I hope you can hear me. I've known Brian for over 20 years. We met in DC at a population strategy conference, and we've been in touch on and off ever since. Uh, this was before he got involved in starting CACOR. Brian was greatly influenced by Herman Daly, who was a senior economist at the World Bank, and he challenged the growth god at the time, and was not that was not well received, but he was very persistent and stuck with it. Um, Brian has carried on, and if he doesn't consider us the plague species, he certainly thinks we've become elephants in the room, where most of us follow the cornucopian and techno-optimist fallacies, thinking we can grow forever. His talk today is about his dealings with the government bureaucracy at the Fish and Wildlife Service and elsewhere. And I know it wasn't fun, but it's made him tough, and I'm sure we'll learn a lot from him. So take it away, Brian.
All right. Thanks a lot, Steve. And thanks to CACOR and your group and your network. You guys have a really good thing going, and I'm thankful to be back with you. Well, sometimes we have to ask ourselves, why don't we hear anything from our civil servants in the federal government and state and county governments as well, Canada and the US? Why don't we hear anything about limits to growth or the conflict between economic growth and environmental protection from some of the leaders or at least some of the workers in these agencies that deal all the time, that work in that context of the conflict between growth and conservation? And so I have a story to tell you. It's my story of why, in my case, nobody heard about the conflict between growth and conservation. And it's in the form of a book now, Gag-Ordered No More. And it's about three things, really, about that conflict between economic growth and environmental protection, which I started to write about and speak about back in the late 1990s. And it's also about the erosion of First Amendment rights in the civil service. And also it provides a vision for conservation agencies, especially the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And it's a story because, there's a lot of literature out there by now about the conflict between growth and conservation. There's a lot of ecological economics literature, but it doesn't seem to get anywhere, even when it is spoken of, because let's face it, it's not that exciting of a topic. The econ syllables right away turn a lot of people away. So now we have a story to tell. And yeah, it happens to be my story. But this book, then, I'm looking at it as sort of a vessel with which to bring the subject matter to light and to into public discussion. And like any story, we have to have a cast of characters or caricatures in this case. And I'm not going to be using actual names. I'll use fictitious names, as you find in the book as well. Now, the book has had a few reviews, the latest by Kirkus, and they summarize their review by calling it a rare and winning combination of policy analysis and expose. So thanks to them for that. I start the book with a preface and an introduction about where I was, what I was doing prior to signing on with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So I'd been a biologist in the field for about 15 years. And then I decided that I was going to go back to school for a PhD because I wanted to do something for conservation at the national level. And so I went to the University of Arizona, and my PhD dissertation was a policy analysis of the Endangered Species Act. And one of the things that I honed in on was the causes of species endangerment in the United States. And these causes, I've said this many times, but these causes struck me as sort of a who's who of the American economy. And I published the list of these causes in Science and elaborated in Bioscience on the economic associations among these different causes of endangerment. And I ended up interpreting the Endangered Species Act as a prescription for a steady state economy, albeit an implicit prescription and probably an unintended prescription by most members of Congress. Well, to give you the flavor of this new book, Gag-Ordered No More, here you see the title of chapter 1, Pontius Pilate Comes to Tucson, in particular to the St. Mark's United Methodist Church, which in 1998 hosted this huge public hearing as the Amphitheater School District of Tucson was up in arms against the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which had proposed designating critical habitat for the cactus ferruginous pygmy owl. And so Representative Jim Colby brought in people from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to defend themselves, you might say. And the fellow that came in from the Washington office, one of the first things he said when he got up to the mic was, "We all know that there is no conflict between growing the economy and protecting endangered species." His name was Dan Crash, and that's where I first encountered the Fish and Wildlife Service, some of the people that I would end up working with over the next couple of decades. I took him to task during the forum after his presentation, after the panel discussion, because, you know, as I say, my PhD included a major component on the fundamental conflict between growing the economy and protecting endangered species. So over the years, Dan was of a different mind about the relationship between economic growth and wildlife conservation, and he made various kind of statements about it. And we have to give him credit for acknowledging finally at some point that, yes, there's a conflict between growth and conservation. However, his own explication of that tended to come out in very small types of venues where there wasn't a whole lot of political pressure involved. And it sort of put the lie to a boast that he made in one of our meetings. It was a land acquisition planning meeting, and the boast that I can drink politics with a fire hose. And, you know, the way I've come to view that is that fire hose was turned way down when it came to the politics of economic growth, down to a mere trickle. So now I still wasn't working for Fish and Wildlife Service. It's still 1998, but I saw this job announcement come out, and now I was actively seeking a job. And the job title was Conservation Biologist. And I would come to find that this was the first job by that title in the Fish and Wildlife Service. And it was a beautiful position description. It called for the person to serve as the focal point for major management, legislative, and regulatory activities, to lead in developing national goals and evaluating key refuge programs. And the conservation biologist had to have a current knowledge of conservation biology, but also emerging national priorities and developing critical issues. And I thought to myself, this is exactly what I've been working for. This is why I went back for a PhD. I applied for the job, and I didn't notice anywhere in the position description any elements that, for example, that those critical issues may not include the 800-pound gorilla of economic growth. I didn't see anything that said the incumbent will be gagged if attempting to apply the principles of ecological economics. So I put in for the job, and I got the job, and, you know, it got off to a pretty good start, frankly. I had the opportunity in the fall of 1999 to brief the director, Jamie Clark, and her directorate, the assistant directors and regional directors, on the fundamental conflict between economic growth and wildlife conservation. And Jamie Clark was very enthusiastic about it. By the end of the talk, she was very animated, and she actually called it the most intellectually stimulating briefing we've had. She had these Wednesday morning briefings on technical matters. And she requested that I come back and tell the group what we could actually do about this. And so I did come back about 6 months later in the spring of 2000, and I brought a proposal for a program for raising awareness of the conflict. Now, I noticed that by then, Jamie was a little less enthusiastic about it. I think what happened was there was a bug put in her ear, maybe one in each ear by some of the directorate about, well, maybe we better not go there. You know, that's maybe beyond the pale for the Fish and Wildlife Service. And she said, well, this is certainly a challenging issue, and I'll put you in touch with our speechwriter. Well, that did happen, but frankly, it didn't matter a whole lot because Jamie was there for less than a year after that when George H.W. Bush was elected. You know, that was the end of a lot of the appointees in the Department of the Interior. They left office. It's too bad because this is the kind of a sub-vision, you might call it, a vision within the broader vision for the Fish and Wildlife Service that I had in mind. I thought that if we could start discussing it among ourselves, it would gradually seep or trickle upward. We would help that to happen. We would get it to go upward to the Secretary of the Interior and thence to cabinet level meetings. And if it had taken 10 or 12 years, then it would have happened during the administration of Barack Obama. And that would have been wonderful because if you look at Obama's history on this topic, you will find that just before he was elected, in an interview that came out in the New York Times, he was adamant that there was some sort of a paradigm shift needed for sustainability in the USA. So we may have had a receptive audience, but just pretend you're a fly on the wall in this cabinet meeting, whatever the year is and whoever the president is, he or her. They announced that the focus of this meeting is going to be on the doldrums of economic growth. Why has the rate of growth been so slow? And so pretty quickly, the president turns this over to the Secretary of Commerce to opine about. Secretary of Commerce is pretty stumped. They realize that $600 billion a year are invested in research and development, so they don't think that's the problem. They recognize that total factor productivity is very stagnant. They think maybe it has something to do with energy supplies being too scarce. So then the discussion goes to the Secretary of Energy, and Secretary of Energy, they relate to us that it's been very slow to develop the renewable sectors that are supposed to complement the other energy sectors that are working full speed to fuel the economy. And the energy sector doesn't really have any answers, but they do say that, well, some of the environmental regulations are pretty tough to deal with, and that slows things down. So then the administrator of the EPA kind of has to point out that, well, we're here with Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act that we have to enforce, and it's not very easy. And there's no real answers coming out to the president's question about why has the growth rate slowed so much. And so it's pretty much open at this point, and nobody wants to say too much. But finally, we have a Secretary of the Interior that steps up to the plate and takes a different approach to this question and says, Mr. President, you know, we've been finding that in the agencies that I work with, that I oversee, the missions of these agencies are almost impossible to accomplish because of economic growth and all the efforts to stimulate more economic growth. And people's eyes open wide, and but the president is listening. And the Secretary of the Interior describes especially what they've been hearing from the Fish and Wildlife Service director about this fundamental conflict between growing the economy and conserving biodiversity. So the president goes away from this meeting, the whole cabinet does, but especially the president with a different line of thought about what to say about economic growth, what to do about economic growth. And one thing that happens is this president eschews the win-win rhetoric that there is no conflict between growing the economy and protecting the environment. So that's progress right there. But furthermore, if it's a president like Obama, there was potential there. And certainly there will be in the future. The president can go away from this feeling at least a little more empowered by a cabinet that's starting to tell it like it is, and thinking about leading the public and the government and the polity at large toward a paradigm shift of steady statesmanship, we might call it. That was a vision. Well, obviously that didn't happen, and it's been delayed by at least decades now. It's not close to happening yet, but it's still a vision. It's too late for a lot of ecological integrity that's already gone under the bridge, but there's still a lot of damages that could yet be lessened if that process happens. Well, speaking of the loss of ecological integrity, one of the first things that I was charged to do when I got to Refuge System headquarters was to lead the development of this policy, which was to implement this clause in the National Wildlife Refuge System Improvement Act of 1997 that called for the maintenance of biological integrity, diversity, and environmental health on the refuge system. And I had been a student of James Carr at the University of Washington, and I was well versed in the concept of ecological integrity. So I brought that into play. I'd used the concept and applied it in the early 1990s when I developed the wildlife management program for the San Carlos Apache tribe in Arizona. So I was very much ready to develop this policy, help develop this policy. And one of the things I pointed out is that we were going to have to recognize some type of frame of reference for ecological integrity, or natural conditions is kind of what it boils down to. And so we did that. And I hope you read that chapter. I'm not going to talk much about what we decided upon as the beginning point, but for the end point, the end of that chronological frame of reference, we chose the year 1800. We had to choose some specific point, and we chose 1800 because it's as good of a demarcation of any of the rampant takeoff of the growth rate of the American economy when the Industrial Revolution was spreading throughout the US. So that was the endpoint in the draft policy that went out for public review and got a lot of positive feedback. But there was a little bit of negative feedback, including by Don Young from Alaska. And in my opinion, our leadership in Fish and Wildlife caved in embarrassingly. And I was gagged. That was one of my first gag orders. I was no longer to use the phrase ecological integrity, which Don Young didn't like. And we were to drop the part in the policy about the rapid rate of economic growth as the endpoint for that framework of natural conditions. So that's where some of the gagging of me began, and I probably would have left the refuge system, possibly even the Fish and Wildlife Service, if I'd thought that some of this leadership was going to be there much longer. It turns out they were there far longer than I would have ever guessed. And that was a miscalculation on my part and just bad luck, maybe as well. Now, I want to describe this is really helps to answer that question. Why don't we hear anything about limits to growth or conflict between growth and conservation? What I saw happen, as a lot of my fellow staffers there in the headquarters of Fish and Wildlife, was that there was a classic clique that formed starting in the early 2000s. It was called the Bible Club. The members thereof even called it the Bible Club, and everybody else a little more pejoratively referred to it as the Bible Club. They would get religion at the Willow, the bar across Utah Street from the main headquarters of the refuge system, and starting around 4 o'clock or so, and for a few hours of beer drinking, what came out of that mix was gospel. And it would be brought back to the office the next day and the next months and the next years. And part of that gospel was that thou shalt not be talking about the 800-pound gorilla of economic growth. And furthermore, thou shalt not let Czech be talking about the 800-pound gorilla. And that was very much enforced by dozens of branch chiefs, division chiefs, and the not just them, but recruits, detailees that were brought in for sort of a testing of the waters of, do they belong in the Bible Club? Do we want them in these chief level positions in the headquarters? They all witnessed this. They heard about the gag orders. They had the discussions at the Willow, and it spread like it was a cultural phenomenon that the 800-pound gorilla was to be excised from all discussion. Well, so into that mix, there comes an effort by an aspiring director and some of the leadership in the agency at that time to develop a new vision for the refuge system. And it's called Conserving the Future. And as a major part of the process of this revisioning for the refuge system, there's the Bold Ideas Forum. It's online, ideas are submitted, people can vote for these ideas. And the plan was that the winning ideas, I think it was like the top 3 or 5 winning ideas, those were to be trotted out at this big culminating session for conserving the future, culminating conference at Madison, Wisconsin, my alma mater. And refuge system staff in particular were encouraged to participate. We were exhorted to participate with extravagant language like think big or go home, and don't hold back, and your wildest dreams. And now it had been a couple of years since I'd had a fresh gag order about the 800-pound gorilla. And I'm looking at these emails and hearing in these staff meetings these exhortations to participate and be bold. So I did it. It's not like anybody here was storming the Bastille or anything. There weren't any really bold ideas, but I had to be at least a little bit bold to even propose this idea, given that Bible Club history and the history of gag orders, to raise public awareness of the trade-off between economic growth and wildlife conservation. And you know what? That idea won the voting in a landslide. Well, how do you think that went over with the Bible Club and with an aspiring director who was very reluctant to get into that topic for political reasons because the Senate confirmation hearings were coming up. So what happened was this Bold Ideas Forum was set to run until Earth Day, and it did. And that idea won. The next day, it disappeared, never to be seen again until some of this archiving software became available. That's how I was able to get these snips. Well, 2011 was a really rough year for me because the backlash against that Bold Ideas Forum activity. And then there was a thing called the Carter incident that happened at the National Conservation Training Center when I tried to get a question into the queue after his talk there about how he could, what he would suggest, what he would have to suggest about us raising awareness of the trade-off between growth and conservation. Because he's a president also that would have provided leadership on that. He did have some precedence in that regard. That caused big trouble for me, and that question never made it to President Carter. There was a FOIA request sent to the Fish and Wildlife Service by peer public employees for environmental responsibility. And that pertained to some of my work in land acquisition planning. So they didn't like that either. And it got the seas got really choppy for me there. I'll never forget the day that a fellow by the name of Boodert showed up in the doorway of my office, kind of looming in the doorway. And we were talking about the Bold Ideas Forum. It was only a week or two after that. And despite the fact that when you went to the Bold Ideas Forum, it said, vote here, his statement was, well, it's not like it was a vote or something. That scared me. That was my first experience with a really unscrupulous attempt to reframe reality in a way that would, once again, to totally gag myself and muffle any kind of conversation about the 800-pound gorilla. It wasn't long after, I think, the Carter incident when I got the 2-week suspension. A 2-week suspension, by the way, is the longest suspension that's legal prior to you having access to the Merit Systems Protection Board, which is sort of like an appeals court for disciplinary action in the civil service. So they had that all figured out. These suspensions, by the way, are without pay. So, you know, I took a heavy hit over my 17 years, the suspensions I had. And then finally, I lost my really nice office, literally, figuratively, and literally. I was moved to a little stuffy office without windows, the worst office in the building, and people called it the closet. Here's kind of, so this is probably as good a spot as any to give a quick summary of the disciplinary action that I put up with. I had seven gaggers. I counted seven. And I had 5 letters of reprimand, 4 suspensions. Actually, I had 2 tours of duty in the closet. My position description was, the job title was changed. The duties were narrowed way back. It was a total shredding of my conservation network and a blockage of my career. This is ironic because I had been putting out, you know, if there was a flaw, not that there was a shortage of flaws on my part. I had, you know, flaws. Maybe the biggest one was I didn't have much of a what do they call it, work-life balance. You know, my career was a lot to me. And so I was doing nights and weekend stuff for Cassie since I was gagged in the day job. Everybody at Fish and Wildlife and outside of Fish and Wildlife called it the day job because they knew I was doing this other stuff, nights and weekends kind of thing. And I published a lot of papers pertaining to the 800-pound gorilla, 3 books, a bunch of book chapters and reviews. And I was giving a lot of talks. I had at least 200 some presentations at conferences primarily. I had a number of keynote addresses, a number of talks, probably in 20 some countries, and had a number of media interviews and actually 3 quite formal debates on the topic of, is there a conflict? Yeah, and like I say, a number of international conferences, and had the opportunity to address the UN General Assembly in New York and actually lead a panel on it was a Harmony with Nature panel, but the 800-pound gorilla was central to that venue. And that doesn't mean I wasn't doing my job back in headquarters, the day job. Yes, I did played the main authoring role of the ecological integrity policy. I certainly pulled the load in the national goals team and the land acquisition priority team, and I brought climate change planning as well to the National Wildlife Refuge System. None of that was happening when I signed on there. One of the things I latched onto early was the sea level affecting marshes model, the SLAM model. And so I kind of shepherded the application of that model to 136 of our 170 some coastal refuges. And we were the leaders in sea level rise planning as a result of that. And then I lead authored and edited this document, Planning for Climate Change on the National Wildlife Refuge System, which was a relatively comprehensive in terms of the climate issues facing the refuge system document. That also was buried by Fish and Wildlife, but you will find it if you Google it up. You'll actually find it because evidently the U.S. Forest Service likes it. Well, thing I want to mention about some of these other products, some of this other work is that the 800-pound gorilla is going to come out of it. If you're talking about climate change in any sort of comprehensive fashion, you're talking about, first of all, the phenomenon of climate change and why it's happening, what some of the potential scenarios are. And the IPCC is very clear that the number one variable in determining greenhouse gas emission scenarios is GDP. So every once in a while, the 800-pound gorilla would come back up, maybe kind of like a mole in a whack-a-mole machine is probably how the Bible Club viewed it. But because of that, I got some really ridiculous kinds of gag orders. These are the two most extreme. One in writing in 2011 that prohibited me from speaking or writing of anything having to do with economics. And at the time, I was, helping to develop a more economical approach to land acquisition. It wasn't all 800-pound gorilla. There were babies thrown out with the bathwater because of that fear of the 800-pound gorilla. I actually got one in 2017. This is a verbal one because there's no way that it would have stood legally in writing. But I got a very clear verbal order that I was not to talk with anyone about anything without first going to this branch chief for permission. Yes, and that lasted, I want to say, 4 or 5 months. And that's very, very nearly impossible to deal with. It certainly trashes a career. It messes with the workplace sociology. You don't say hi to people. You don't smile. Uh, Everybody thinks you're taciturn. Before you know it, your professional networks in the agency are shredded. Your promotion potential's gone. I tried to transfer a few times. The best I was able to get out of those efforts was a short detail at the USGS, and that was good. One of the very few bright spots. But in essence, government career is trashed when that kind of gag order starts creeping in. Well, yeah, I mentioned there's some babies in the bathwater when you toss out the 800-pound gorilla. In my case, I had been active on some interagency roundtables, very active on the roundtable on sustainable forests. I was one of the authors of the first report, the 2003 report. And by the way, I think that's maybe still the only, and it certainly was one of the first federal government documents where you will find a reference to the conflict between economic growth and biodiversity conservation. Like I say, the climate change planning was tossed under the bus, and yeah, there's some more. Oh, maybe one of the biggest babies that was thrown out with the. It really bothers me that I have to call raising awareness of the conflict between growth and conservation bathwater. That, this is why I'm here giving this talk, and that's why I wrote the book. It shouldn't have to be considered a bathwater that babies get thrown out with, but whatever, it's works as a metaphor here. And one of the babies thrown out with the bathwater was the Mobile Tensaw Delta National Wildlife Refuge. It would have been the contiguous landholding with the greatest biodiversity on the North American continent. And as a big bonus, we were developing a great relationship with E.O. Wilson to make this happen. Well, when the Bible Club et al. Discovered that Ed Wilson had signed the CACI position on economic growth right in his lab at Harvard, it wasn't long, and I was pulled off of that as well. The collaboration with Ed Wilson fell apart, and that refuge may not have survived some of the Alabama politics anyway. But in any event, we could have had a long-lasting relationship with Ed Wilson. So I had to start asking myself, why is there such a recalcitrant sort of objection to any kind of reasonable consideration of these ecological macroeconomics? And well, there's some real obvious things, like there weren't a lot of people that had much knowledge about the topic, and people get out of their comfort zone. And there was a general unwillingness to deal with the big picture, long-term issues. There was more of a hook and bullet approach to wildlife management, where we got to plant corn and soybeans for ducks and geese kind of thing. There was very much that the Bible Club clique that applied, especially in hiring practices. And so very quickly, the entire sociology of the refuge system headquarters was, suppressive of the guerrilla. And then, of course, in the case of Crash, well, there was the Senate confirmation hearings that drove his motivation to censor. And but then there was something a little more, I don't know, borderline nefarious. I feel that there was the phenomenon that people were getting into these Bible Club positions and suddenly found themselves making lots of money and having these splendid lifestyles, especially with travel to some of the most beautiful places on the planet, and getting paid big bucks for doing that. And they didn't want that apple cart upset. So they were only very, it took very little encouragement to apply that gag order. Well, yeah, in fact, I even have a chapter on this called Joyriding on Taxpayer Dollars. We're running out of time, so I'm going to pretty much skip it. But there's an abuse of the travel privilege. There certainly was at refuge system headquarters. I don't know to what degree that still is the case, but probably to some degree. So what did I do all this time to try to fight back, aside from nights and weekends work? Well, one thing I did is I served as a visiting professor for Virginia Tech for about 12 of those years. And so then I was able to teach courses in steady state economics and stuff. And yeah, I established CACI, as Steve mentioned early. That was back in 2003. Networked with Peer quite a bit. And I filed some grievances toward the end when I was really starting to give up on trying to win this battle, win this war. I started filing grievances and a harassment claim and all that. And I wrote Gag-Ordered No More. Now, one thing I want to stress is that again, there was bad luck involved because there was plenty of support in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service itself for raising public awareness about the conflict between growth and conservation. It's just that, unfortunately, it wasn't in my division. It wasn't in the refuge system. It was in divisions like fisheries, international affairs, environmental contaminants, and so on. And the National Wetlands Inventory, where Bill Weiland was chief, and a great friend and ally, not only with the 800-pound gorilla, but with sea level rise planning. And the refuge system underwent these two efforts to develop a vision for the refuge system. The first one was called Fulfilling the Promise, and that ran from about 2000 to 2010. And there's the one that I mentioned earlier called Conserving the Future. I think it's probably still considered the vision. But it's Conserving the Future sans the bold ideas, as you know. And I would propose that it's time for them to come up with a new vision. And I think it ought to be called True Conservation. It's got to start with the director. And the director is going to have a solid background of the history of wildlife conservation. They're going to recognize that we're into the fourth major episode of wildlife decline after those episodes of overhunting and habitat loss and pollution, none of which have been completely solved anyway, and they all took a heavy toll. But now we've got sort of this mothership of a problem, the 800-pound gorilla, which itself is a problem because due to the tremendous breadth of the human niche, the economy grows at the competitive exclusion of non-human species in the aggregate. That's the ecological macroeconomics of it in one sentence. But furthermore, economic growth exacerbates all these other problems, and it's going to resuscitate the problem of overhunting because as we breach limits to economic growth, there's going to be widespread poaching and violation of these conservation easements that Fish and Wildlife is so proud of, violation en masse. So the themes of true conservation I propose should be a conservation ethic, a steady state economics, the right kind of approach to land conservation, maintenance of ecological integrity, protecting legally and politically the Endangered Species Act, conserving biodiversity, and obviously adapting now to climate change. And the one that in our context is worth elaborating on slightly is the steady state economics. Once again, that's got to start with the director and needs to eschew any win-win rhetoric. But not only that, they need to begin to explicate the conflict between growth and conservation. Having these two bullet points together reminds me of that saying, half the truth is the biggest lie. We don't want only lack of bald-faced lying. We want some leadership on raising awareness of the conflict between growth and conservation. And this can be trained. Our staff and partner groups, other conservation organizations can be trained at the National Conservation Training Center. It ought to come out in FWS publications and in congressional testimony. And then that vision of upreach to the Secretary of the Interior spilling over into the cabinet. Okay, so just a couple more slides here. I know that there's probably going to be a lot of comments and questions, but what can we do about the 800-pound gorilla? We that are not in the civil service. Well, you know what? This isn't the kind of issue where you got to be doing something all the time, like, swinging a hammer or drafting blueprints for infrastructure. This is the type of issue that takes a lot of conversation, a lot of planning, a lot of reforming of policies and programs like the educational program at NCTC. But for us, we can communicate with these agencies We can communicate with the agency directors, even at the secretarial level. Send them letters, request meetings. They'll meet with you. They'll meet or they'll send staff. And a lot of you are experts in limits to growth and conflict between growth and conservation. You can offer training, make it economical for them. Join peer can help develop FOIA requests to these agencies about what have you been saying about the relationship between economic growth and environmental protection, and what haven't you been saying? Ask them about the travel while you're at it too. And if you're going to do this, when you go to meet with one of these people, be very concise, keep it very simple, no rocket science, but just demand that leadership on raising awareness of the conflict between economic growth and environmental protection. And I would urge you to use that crystal clear phrase. It will sink in and spread out if everyone does. Leave them with a briefing statement, a brochure, a book, and make sure to request a follow-up, because they'll probably forget about it unless you do, and they won't if you do. And these are some of your primary agencies to contact. I'm sorry haven't listed Canadian agencies here, but obviously we have the interior agencies and some of the ag offices and EPA, and in commerce, there's the National Marine Fisheries Service. And I write some more about this in the book. Same thing with Big Green. We should be having the same conversations with them, and taking them to task for their win-win rhetoric. It still persists with a number of these. Well, okay, so this is about it. I should acknowledge, in a way, the cast of caricatures. I don't hold any grudges anymore. I haven't been there for 5 years, but I feel like the story needs to be told. We have to see why it is that there hasn't been any kind of leadership, even any kind of conversation coming from our tax-paid conservation professionals about the conflict between growth and conservation. And I did notice that the caricaturing makes people look better, better than I remember. They look nicer. So I thought I'd give it a try myself. It didn't turn out as well, but at least I'm gag-ordered no more. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brian. I've noticed a couple of questions in the chat and several comments. I hope I'm being heard because I don't see myself on the screen. Do I get any responses? Is anybody hearing
I
me?
can hear you.
We can hear you.
We can hear you.
All right, well, you know what? I've got my video stopped. Maybe that's probably the reason. Let's try it now. Okay, there we go. All right. Well, I'm seeing Dave Doherty's name when I'm talking, but it's the way it goes. Well, I can start with one question, Brian. I mean, yeah, it's you did talk about energy early on, and there's a lot of discussion now, both in the investment communities from some very serious analysts, and I follow this very closely, and it's been going on for several years, and it's getting harsher and harsher in that they're warning about traditional oil production peaking, and the heavy tar sands and inferior quality stuff is trying to carry a load, and there's a net energy problem with that stuff because you have to put a lot of calories in to get usable material out. And if diesel ever is in shortages, not only home heating in many places, but particularly in diesel and trucking, I think the electrification hopes are going to prove false. It's not going to ramp up. There's not the infrastructure. There's not the copper and the lithium and other stuff. So what I'm getting to is, besides peak pollinators, aquifers, topsoil, and pollution, we have the driver of economic growth being energy. And if that's peaking, we might have this steady state and then a decline involuntarily. So in a sense, that particular battle may be won, but with much more suffering than if it had been planned for. So you might want to comment on that. And David Pollock will be on deck.
I agree, Steve. I think that that prospect at least is conceivable, that energy scarcity could be enough to ramp GDP down from a growth rate toward a steady state, possibly even some amount of degrowth. The problem is, as you alluded to, uh, it if it happens, let's say naturally like that, instead of politically, instead of with planning, instead of with intentionality. First of all, it may not happen nearly soon enough, uh, and it's definitely not going to help much in terms of environmental protection, because if the overriding domestic policy goal is GDP growth, we're going to be pulling out all the stops with these energy sources, all of them, clean coal, dirty coal, clean oil, bad oil, tar sands, shale oil, and hydro damming up more rivers again. We had some semblance of sanity and backing off of that for a while. That will go the other direction, the cluttering up the coastlines, trying to get wave energy, etc. Taking up prime ag land for solar and wind energy. So the goal of GDP growth is starting to cause more problems than it solves, even if the GDP growth itself isn't supported.
I'm with you, and particularly biomass is being called green. It's not very green if you keep cutting down forests.
Right.
Okay, David Pollock.
Good. Thanks, Brian, for your presentation. I've got a small question and a larger question. The small question was, I'm aware that in the Canadian civil service, they can really shut down your ability to do these nighttime presentations, if you like. And I was just curious, when you surprised me when you said you've been able to do 200 presentations and address the UN and so on. And I was just at that point in your presentation, I was wondering whether or not your bosses couldn't lean on some of your extracurricular activities. So that's the small question. The larger question is, when you reference the desirability of steady state economics, I'm always interested in people's view as to, if you assume a growing population, are you assuming a lower standard of living in terms of resource use, and that therefore lower standards of living will occur materially? Or are you assuming that technology can somehow enter in and close that gap so that we can have a steady state economics? So it's just a little more reflection on your understanding of how one could actually operationalize steady state economics given a government willing to do so. Any thoughts would be helpful. Thanks.
Okay. Well, that first question is really not suited for a short answer. I do write about the case of Garcetti versus Ceballos that was decided by the slimmest of Supreme Court, with 3 dissents written and 4 dissenters of the 9. But essentially, until that, which occurred in 2006, the First Amendment was still going fairly strong within the civil service. But after that, it hasn't. It's taken a lot of civil servants, including the higher level, like supervisory staff, to recognize the implications of Garcetti versus Ceballos. And they may now be able to shut down a lot of nights and weekends kind of activity, but that would really be stretching it in the USA. Now, I want to clarify, David, that I was not representing the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service at those conferences that I referenced with that slide. I was always wearing either the Virginia Tech hat or probably even more often the CACI hat.
Okay, I understood. Yeah.
Yep. With regard to the steady state economy with the growing population, no, to clarify, we, if people have a look at the CACI position on economic growth, we're very upfront, up right at the top in recognizing that a steady state economy entails a stabilized population as well as per capita production and consumption of goods and services. The thing that probably surprises some people is that we have the body of research and analysis and literature that we have produced demonstrating that steady state economy can be measured in terms of GDP. GDP, we have a regression model that, well, I think this was the last talk I gave for you guys, that tight relationship between GDP and the ecological footprint, such that we don't have to strain ourselves so hard to try to measure what that throughput is. Through Herman Daly's the concept of throughput, it's outstanding conceptual stuff, but it's not that administratively tenable. So we have to have something measurable. Turns out we're lucky in that regard. GDP cuts it.
Mm-hmm.
GDP works.
Okay, I neglected to
Thanks,
give
Brian.
heads up to Richard. Are you still having more? Go ahead.
No, I was just saying thank you for your reflection to Brian. I'm done.
Sure.
Thank you.
Okay, so Richard Vanderyacht had a question, and then
Yep.
I have Karen and Samrat coming up too.
Okay, so my question is, well, actually a comment and a question. It's true, even when I was publishing a paper on something related to academic work I did prior to joining Health Canada, I had to declare with the Conflict of Interest Office saying I'm publishing this paper. Is that okay? And I said it had nothing to do with my work from Health Canada. They said, well, no, you can still be looked up on the internet. They could still find out you work for Health Canada, so you still have to declare it to us. And, there was potential that they could have told me I couldn't have my name on the paper.
Mm-hmm.
But the second question is, how long after you leave the federal public service is there a gap between leaving the public service and being able to speak freely without being said, without being told you're in a conflict of interest and having some repercussion from that?
Well, I don't know that there is a formal period of time. I bet there could be for political appointees.
Yeah.
But, the civil service of the United States of America has a proud history going back to Theodore Roosevelt. It was designed to obviate these instances of political suppression and censorship of important public matters. And so I believe the system is still reasonably okay, even despite the Supreme Court's decision on Garcetti versus Ceballos. But Richard, I think the more practical matters are, how far are their political tentacles, and how can those impact you once you're out and on nights and weekends while you're in? And there's a lot of impact, absolutely, especially on, I mentioned all those talks. I missed out on many, many, many more as a result of that, especially toward the end. I was cut off at the knees. I couldn't pick up a phone. I couldn't talk in the halls. So that definitely has an impact on your nights and weekends too.
I'm sure. I'm sure. Well, it's a very excellent talk. Well, thank you for that.
Thank you.
Okay, so Karen.
Oh, hi there, Brian. This is Karen Bryant.
It's hard to hear you.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I was following on Sam Ratz. I had two questions, a couple questions also, but I was following on Sam Ratz. He mentioned capitalism. Maybe capitalism could be the issue. And then the other question I had was related to the population increase issue, and I was saying, why not luxury taxes and actual tax on corporations? And then I wanted you to show your slide again of the agencies to contact.
Oh, gladly. Well, to your first point or / question about capitalism, maybe capitalism could be the issue. Well, so I wasn't even proposing that. In fact, when I would brief people like the director and, other of the chiefs there, I would say we don't necessarily have to act like Marxists. We don't even have to say anything about the particular model of political economy. If we're asked, we can point out that the American Constitution is certainly amenable and flexible to having a smart enough democratic rider of the capitalist horse. There's all gradations of capitalism. There's no laissez-faire anymore with the full body of law that we have at this point in history. And theoretically, like I go back to Karen, the Endangered Species Act, if that were enforced to the letter of the law, it would establish a steady state economy. Now, albeit one with a lot of species, if you view life as like a tree of life, a lot of these branches would be barely hanging on yet, but because they're listed as threatened or endangered. But that listing, when enforced properly through the rest of the ESA, results in like stop signs to the various economic activities and sectors out there on the landscape. But that said, I will have to acknowledge in non-government conversation, which this is, that capitalism is very conducive to rapid rates of economic growth. But I'll say one last thing about that. So was Soviet communism, which tore up their environment every bit as badly as capitalism has North American. So I don't know. I think that's why we focus at CACI less on the type of or the model of political economy and more on the macroeconomic goal of growth, regardless what that model of political economy is. With regard to luxury taxes, we're all for them. One of our policy specialists, Daniel Wartell London, I think that's one of the bills he's worked on. We're developing the Steady State Economy Act, and every month we kick off a new, what we call feeder bill, which will become an element of the more omnibus type of Steady State Economy Act. So thank you for the, every time somebody weighs in on something, we're just like a Secretary of the Interior, the squeaky wheel gets the grease kind of thing. We're that much more inclined now to focus on luxury tax as opposed to other feeder bills than we would have been before you mentioned that. So thank you for that.
Okay, thank you for your answers.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, Dave Doherty, you're up.
Okay, thank you, Brian. I did find that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service did publish a second or perhaps even more than one sustainable forest report in I think it was 2020. So after you left, I guess. And I put the link in the chat. I also put in a link to your first document from 2003. My question is this one, rhetorical in a sense. I would like to know, from where do you suspect that the idea sprang that human population growth is a good thing?
Oh, well, I guess it sprang from a number of places and a number of types of places, like theological even and evolutionary, but politically, it's in terms of economics, political economy, there's a real interesting overlooked source, I think, which is that, the conventional or neoclassical economists, they are pro population growth, not just because they're pro GDP growth, because, obviously GDP is population times per capita consumption. So you might simplistically assume, or logically assume, okay, neoclassical economists are going to be pro population growth because all else equal, it's going to grow GDP. But there's a much more nuanced and shocking, in a way, aspect, which is that they actually think that a growing population is conducive to growing per capita GDP. And the reason they think that is that it goes back to the old Julian Simon ultimate resource stuff, that, okay, the more people there are, the more brains there are out on the planet. And they think there's essentially increasing returns to scale on brains. So you're going to have a rapidly developing technological regime when you have more and more people. And there's some semblance of reality to that, except when you start to bump up against the ecological limits, which they do not have a grasp of. So that's the bad part.
If I can jump in, Brian, this is Steve. There's a couple of other longstanding drivers for that. One is military. The number of soldiers that powers had for centuries was based on their population. You did mention religion, and of course, they all want a bigger flock, whether they believe what they're espousing or not. They get more tithes from a bigger flock, right? You also have an oversupply of labor, which helps keep wages down, which the elite investors, capitalists want. And I'm not anti-capitalist. It's just a fact. If you have an oversupply of something, the price goes down. And the last factor is indebted governments. Once we went into deficit financing, politicians, if they didn't have growing populations, they wouldn't see their debts being paid off as quickly. Yeah. Anyway, I hope I didn't chase you away.
No, I had to get the charger because I just noticed my battery is.
I'm going to have mine plugged in.
I'm going to have to shut this little light off and put this battery charger. Speaking of energy.
Yeah. Okay, so as I say, you have your three main global institutions as governments in debt. They need growing revenues, and they're spending your grandchildren's money. It's natural to buying power, maintaining their status in their careers. So you have military, you have indebted governments, you have religions, and you have business. Those are your main global institutions, and shrinkage they're all allergic to shrinkage. So aside from the biological drive to reproduce, this has been my specialty for 25 years or 30 years with the population. So it's a little bit of research and writing I did on it led me to this conclusion.
Yeah, thanks for stepping in there on that one. That's
Sure.
pretty good summary of it.
Right. Well, it looks like I've got 3 new messages on the chat, so I've got to take a look. Well, looks like Claude has another question. Claude Butner.
No, I'm actually saying that there are other better questions. I put my softball
I see
question
what you
in.
mean. Okay. I got you. Well, I saw one above it, but it's okay. He's just asking for your opinion about how long will it take before we have a climate change candidate during presidential elections. Well, Trump is a denier, but anyway, most of the other ones will give it at least an even keel approach.
Yeah.
Well, if we don't have any more questions, I think we're going to have to tie it up. Is one of the officers going to thank Brian, or maybe I'll just be doing it myself?
If Ted Manning is here, he should be doing it. I
didn't look through the list.
Yeah, I haven't looked
he's
yet. I'll do it
there.
now.
Okay, could I just get my question in before?
Oh, sorry, Art. I somehow missed it.
Yeah. I just wanted to ask the question, is the 800-pound gorilla growing? And is there, and a follow-on to that, is there any limit to its size?
Yeah, that the metaphor is useful in a lot of different ways. So one thing we used to when it was okay to talk about it a little bit, we'd say the 800-pound gorilla has 2 arms. One is population and the other is per capita consumption. So, and that gorilla is just causing more problems with those 2 big growing arms as they both grow. It's more of an ecological that gorilla tends to walk on the hands a lot. So there's more of an ecological footprint as the gorilla grows, population or per capita consumption. Yeah, so if we look at, there's 2 ways to use that metaphor, the 800-pound gorilla as the economy, in which case, absolutely, yes, it's growing very problematically. If you instead use the metaphor of the 800-pound gorilla as economic growth itself, well, then what would that, is the problem of addressing economic growth growing? Maybe not. And that goes back to Karen asked for this slide to come back up on agencies to contact. So there that is. And our ability to talk about the 800-pound gorilla, that I think is a problem that should be shrinking as the degrowth movement, is burgeoning in Europe, and the organizations in North America dealing with things like overshoot and ecological footprint, but it's really crucial that there's all hands on deck kind of approach to this, and we need these agencies to do their part. They're getting paid to do this. We're volunteering here, basically, right? And a lot of the people in these organizations get paid pretty well too. In fact, the leadership of them is probably even higher paid than our political appointees and chiefs of the conservation agencies. So we just have to keep calling them to account for the truth about the conflict between growth and environment.
I thank Brian for joining us. Ted Manning with the Canadian Association with the Club of Rome. I think you have brought up common issues that we have had in Canada as well, and I'll just mention 1 or 2 things. First, like all of us, we are pre-programmed for growth, and we are being reprogrammed for growth on a regular basis at our own expense. And if you start watching social media, the amount of money spent to have us continue to focus on growth for the benefit of a few is so excessive that really even our governments can't manage it. That said, the same kind of issues, I worked in the Canadian government in a similar position to you for a long time. In fact, I was head of sustainable development for a while. And our problem was just like you. They didn't want us talking to anybody. We were not suppressed completely, but they did definitely want to check what we said. And in fact, I remember sending some of my stuff to colleagues in the United States at a time when they were less suppressed than us, and they would publish it under their name. And in exchange, I did joint publications for them. Anyway, there's another element to that too. I had one big success. I was head of the social center, one of the directors of the Social Science Federation of Canada, and we actually negotiated with the government the ability for our scientists to put their names on their publications. And we did it by simply making the case that the politicians and the leaders did not wish to be charged if we got something wrong. So they wanted our name on it so they had someone to blame. And on that basis, since about 1988, we have actually been allowed, should we be able to do so, to put our names on publications. That has not been a problem since I quit government a few years ago, but it has definitely been a common feature. The fact is that we are hired to be peons, not to be experts. And that is unfortunately true. As I say, we are being programmed to say, yes, sir, how high. Anyway, I'm sorry, I'm overreacting to your presentation, or maybe I'm not, but I thought it was excellent. Okay, so that said, thank you very much for talking to us. We do this once a week. There are more interesting ones coming up, and on the idea of fighting growth is a very big thing that we are trying to do as an association, along with our colleagues overseas, to try and make a difference, to get people to actually consider values more broadly than just how much money they have in their pocket. So, well, thank you again for coming and talking to us and raising some very, very interesting questions and examples. And we will probably talk again on the same subject. It just doesn't seem to be going away. Here comes the commercial. For those of you who do not belong to the Canadian Association for the Club of Rome, please visit our website. It's very easy to join, doesn't cost much, and you get all this stuff once a week, plus access to our website, plus access to a lot of other very interesting people, and to our webinar, to our web Google groups, where there are very interesting conversations on issues just like this going on 24/7. I would also say, if you miss any of our presentations, please go on our website, and they are also available as YouTubes, and some of them are very, very well viewed. And please subscribe when you do so, because that gives us a reputation that we don't mind having. So thank you again for coming. And now we will simply turn off the recording, and it'll be open for any kind of conversations people wish to pursue.